ensure quality for the benefit of the consumer, federal inspectors examine and certify each carcass at the packing plant. Beef, like other meats, varies some in quality. Inspection and identification ensures that each carcass is placed in the proper grade. By this means, when the purchaser buys choice beef, he gets choice beef. And if a lesser quality is satisfactory, it is so identified. Grading is based on the qualification of the entire carcass, and labeling is done in such a way that each cut will bear the mark of the grade. This mark is the consumer's guarantee of wholesomeness and quality. Possibly no one has done a better job to cater to the consumer's taste and demands than the packing industry. Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. In his way, the meat cutter is an artist. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
What up, meatheads? This is Travis, American Butcher, and this is the Meat Block Podcast. And if you can tell by that double intro, both sampled from the same video, Ring the Bell, which I highly recommend you go check out on YouTube. Just type in Ring the Bell Beef and watch that whole documentary in its post-World War II glory. And what that video is trying to do is show the consumer where their meat comes from and what goes into it, and they use words like quality and wholesomeness, and they talk about the meat grading system. And back then it was the top of the line was choice, then it went select, and then from there you had no rolls, which means no rolls because they didn't roll a stamp on them, and it went from choice, select, standard, commercial, utility, canner, and actually before canner was cutter. So canner was the worst. And I looked all over the internet to find pictures of these subgrades for educational standing, to find like cross sections of the rib. So because I don't know how you determine subgrades, because in my research and through my experience, I've never had to dealt with it. Actually, in my experience as a butcher, I've never dealt with the American meat grading system in general. The most I've had to do with, as far as what would be perceived as a quality check, would be grass-fed and grass-finished and organic, which none of those have a grading system. And then working in the slaughter industry, we used to do these coal cows, and they're cows that are losing money versus making money in the dairy industry, so that it makes sense to kill them. And there would be a live grading where a representative of our plant who was took some test where he was the official live grader, and he would work at an auction. And if he told you a steer was 1,400 pounds, then you had to take his word like it was legal affidavit. But he would go out to the pens and look at all these old burnt out dairy cows waiting to die, and he would look at their rounds, and he would give them checks, plus, check minus, double minus, and then he would give that information to the owner of the meat, because it was a co-op. It was a organic dairy co-op that turned their ground beef turned their burnt out cows into organic ground beef. So he would send that information to the people in charge of the co-op, in charge of paying out the farmers. Like, we'd get 40 head of beef, and we'd be like, all right, this ear tag is +1 or check plus. This one is -1 or check minus. And it would correlate. He'd put it on a sheet. Then the overall herd would be converted into one lot, and then people would get paid out appropriately based on these specs of hot weight and the quality they brought to us when they were alive. And I use the term quality very loosely, even though this is going into premium, organic, all natural, pastured, ground beef that you would find at the most high-end grocery store. It was also old Holsteins and Jerseys that, say we got 40, because I'm saying the number 40 because that's what we'd get every Friday. They'd be dropped off on Thursday, and we wouldn't be surprised if 3 of them died before we killed them on Friday morning. And us being a small plant, it wasn't in our financial reason, because we didn't have to have a USDA grader on staff. Our farmers had to adapt to the fact that it was going to be ungraded product. Now, just because something doesn't have the word prime, choice, or select on it does not mean it is not quality. And the flavor that rides on the fat or marbling within the meat is going to have more of a say whether it's quality or not. If that animal was eating shit and the fat tasted terrible or had a certain form of rancidity because of something bitter it was eating, then it wouldn't be quality in my mind, even if there was an abundance of marbling. For example, I one time took home a ribeye of this 8-year-old Highlander that was beautifully marbled and thought it was going to be amazing. And I got it home and I had to stab it with a fork about 400 times before I cooked it because it was tougher than shit. But then you get some loose of a goose, Jersey in there that's, just as old with zero marbling. And you could smush your fingers into a steak to the point where they touch with little to no ease. And it's tender, but is that tenderness a result or equal to quality? So it's just what you, the consumer, want. You want a nice marbled fat flavor profile? You want something lean? So the grading system works here for the average consumer who thinks that I like prime beef, so that's what I'm going to get. Or I'm okay with choice, so that's what I'm going to get. But I'm afraid that the grading system may limit people in their shopping habits by not wanting to try a local farm because they're going to be stuck into some form because that farm can't afford to get it processed at a place that has a USDA grader. This first piece is by David.
Hey gang, if you're anything like me, you have little to no contact with graded beef. As a processor that primarily slaughters and cuts for other farmers who either sell direct to consumer or to farmers market, a gradation on a label means almost nothing to me. And my clients, I guess. Much of America's consumer base is moving away from the big box grocery store, and therefore the name and face of meat marketing is changing rapidly, and grading is included in that change. There are, however, massive amounts of consumers and institutions that buy their bovine proteins at a price determined in part by a grade given by an FSIS inspector at a processing plant. The USDA utilizes 2 separate grades for beef: quality and yield. These marks are meant to separate cattle and beef carcasses into groups that are more uniform. This allows the consumer, in theory, to feel as if they're getting a consistent product every time they buy it. Grading is a voluntary process that a packer will pay the USDA for. And in turn, you get the stamps on your product that you can only get from them. So what brought this system about? According to a paper by J.J. Harris from the Department of Animal Science at Texas A&M University, in 1902, Herbert Mumford from the University of Illinois authored a series of bulletins entitled Market Classes with Grades of Cattle with Suggestion for Interpreting Market Quotations. The reasons behind these bulletins were, number 1, the necessity to establish classes and grades for cattle in order to report market conditions that would be intelligible through the public press, and number 2, the desire to provide feeders and breeders of beef cattle with a thorough knowledge of the classes and grades of cattle as they relate to market and feedlot requirements. These bulletins included descriptions, definitions, and or photographs of 5 market classes of cattle and 7 market grades: prime, choice, good, medium, common, cutter, and canner. Some of those we still have today. There was a growing demand throughout the livestock industry, meat industry, and consuming public for uniform grading standards for livestock and meat. This need for uniform grades and market reporting led Congress in 1914 to appropriate funds for the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA as we know them, to study agricultural marketing and to establish an Office of Markets and Rural Organization. As a result of this study, Congress passed a law in 1916 establishing the National Livestock Market News Service. This service required some type of classification system to facilitate accurate market reporting. Further justification for this service and the development of a classification system was consumer disappointment with meat purchases and their demand for identifying meat by grade. The National Livestock Market News Service would respond to livestock producers' need to have an unbiased, daily livestock market report, and the belief amongst producers that accurate daily market reports by a third party would aid them in selecting the best markets for their breed stock and their livestock. These market reports by the USDA began in 1917. So the government, at this point, had to refine the criteria in order to firm up the grading guidelines that had been requested by the public. They went to work, and in 1916, the very first dressed beef carcass standards were developed. They began by trying out the new system while selecting beef for the Navy, Army, and the Allied troops during World War I. Soon after that, they were able to allow some institutions to adopt the grading system into their buying programs. Once Uncle Sam worked at a basic game plan for instituting their program in a feasible fashion, they opened the floor up to the public to take comments, criticism, improvements, etc. 10 different town hall style meetings were held around the country in order to kind of include butchers, packers, producers, food, and agricultural media and educators as well. Once the opinions were collected by all these people and they've had their open floor discussions, the grades were updated and the official United States standards for grades of carcass beef were adopted in mid-1926. So, they sunk 9 years into researching and developing this grading system. In mid-1927, the government opened up grading to producers for a 1-year free trial period. It seems that the majority of the meatpacking industry was opposed to these guidelines, mostly because they had been working on their own system for quite some time. The government may never have gotten their program off the ground, in fact, if it wasn't for a new group of producers and processors called a new and small group of producers and processors called the Better Beef Association, which is now defunct, but similar to today's National Cattlemen's Beef Association. The meatpacking industry also came up with their own grading system. It was called the Standard Beef Grading System and Packer's Guide for Grading, as developed by the Committee on Marketing and approved by the Executive Committee. That failed, mostly, I think, because of how long and boring the title is. Seriously, what a mouthful. Anyways, after this trial period, the response was so overwhelmingly positive from the consumer base and the producers that the program was continued as a service that was voluntary but fee-based, which it still is today. It's gone through many changes since then, and if you're curious about the most recent history of grading, let me know and I can send some info your way, or some resources for further reading. For now, however, let's take a look at the grading regulations the way they were and the way they are today in the U.S. Like I mentioned earlier, there's 2 grading systems that are used concurrently in the U.S., quality grades and yield grades. First, let's take a look at quality grading. We're all familiar with the 3 top grades for beef: prime, choice, and select. But did you know there are actually 8 different grades? The latter 5 are standard, commercial, utility, cutter, and canner, in that order. The final 3 are almost exclusively used in value-added products, like canned soup and jerky and whatnot. In fact, there's a very expensive brand of beef jerky that's produced at a plant relatively close to me that advertises that it is 100% tenderloin. But what it doesn't say is that it's all utility and cutter grade meat, all dairy cull over 3.5 years of age. And it may as well be a Denver or something else, a loin off of a select or choice beef. Quality grades are determined by evaluating both carcass maturity and marbling. So let's talk about maturity first. Relative maturity and actual chronological age and maturity are not the same thing. Since beef carcasses are not labeled with birth records, as they go through the plant, FSIS grading inspectors can estimate a beef's age by certain physiological indicators. The government stance basically is that a beef's age has a consistent effect on the tenderness of the beef and like the cutability. As an aside, just real quick, this is probably true with most conventional grain-fed animals. This and many other categories just don't really fit the grass-fed stock in the same way. Some of the best and most tender beef I've ever had have been 4 to 5 year old Angus cull cows. Anyways, I digress. There are 5 maturity grades. Grade A, which is for 9 to 30 months. B, which is from 30 to 42 months. C, which is from an estimated 42 to 72 months. Grade D, which is 72 to 96 months of age. And grade E, which is older than 96 months. To oversimplify it, the carcass maturity is determined by the size, shape, and ossification of the bones, and certain bones. Ossification is when cartilage becomes bone. You know how sometimes when you're quartering a beef, and there's that one rib that you have to cut through when you're going through the flank. Sometimes it's a lot harder than you expected. Sometimes it's just soft cartilage. Ever notice that it's always on older bulls and cull milkers? That process right there is called ossification, when that cartilage turns to bone. And there's a handful of bones that inspectors use as indicators. For example, the tips of the ridge bones in the vertebral column. Rib bones also transition from being round to being wide and flat. That's another physical indicator. A second change happens with maturity as part of gradation. In young beef, the muscle is more pale and fine. The older a beef gets, the darker the meat comes, and the grain of the muscles becomes a lot more coarse and kind of defined. Once the relative carcass maturity has been determined, the next stop is to evaluate the marbling within the maturity group, because marbling generally has a direct correlation with maturation. A maturity grade A prime moves proportionally towards maturity grade E canner. There's a graph that you can find online, and it shows how those two generally will follow a proportional curve. The marbling of the ribeye at the 12th rib is what the score is based upon for marbling. We've all seen a photo of a grading inspector looking at the ribeye when they've, just cut the carcass open right at the 12th rib. The degrees of marbling range from abundant to practically devoid. This is how much and how well fat is dispersed intramuscularly. In addition to fat, muscle grading may also include color and firmness, with an ideal ribeye having abundant, evenly distributed fat, cherry red in color, with a firm, fine texture. This is the primary criteria for which the final grade is based. Once these two factors, maturity and marbling, are established, the two values are put into a standard equation to find the final grade. The second type of grading are yield grades. The USDA defines its yield grading as a system to evaluate the cutability of a beef carcass. And then they go on to further define cutability as the yield of trimmed, boneless retail cuts from the main primals, which are round, loin, rib, and chuck in this instance. It's meant as an estimate and gives a range of 5 grades, 1 through 5, about what kind of yield you can expect from this carcass. It's broken down like this. Grade 1 is a greater than 52.3% yield. Grade 2 is 50 to 52.3%. Grade 3 is 47.7 to 50% yield. Grade 4 is 45.4 to 47.7. And less than 45.4% yield is a grade 5. The yield grade is broken down to an equation with 4 variables: external fat thickness on the rib, surface area of the ribeye itself, estimated percentage of suet in relation to carcass weight, and hot carcass weight. Yield grading pertains much less to consumers as they do producers trying to market their beef, but also fine-tune their production program. Those 4 factors that I just mentioned in the previous paragraph are put into a special equation, and they all kind of carry different weight. And as they're added up with each other, it gives that yield grade. This year, I did some of my own grading, kind of loose grading of some lambs that I butchered. After a few more years of compiling data, I think I'll actually be able to dial in my feeding, finishing, and slaughter schedule, as well as experiment with genetics. I had some animals that were given primarily a forage that I accidentally overseeded my legumes, and they were almost too fat, which was really surprising how quickly these guys put on weight. So, this year I'm going to be able to fine-tune my forage and get a better balance between my carbohydrates and proteins. One thing I'd like to see, actually, would be a separate grading system for 100% grass-fed beef. I think this would potentially do a few things to the grass-fed market. First, I do think that it would push farmers to be more selective and proactive about their forage. I guess I can only speak personally from, local experience, but many graziers around here I know rely solely on naturalized forage, which is oftentimes invasive and inadequate. This type of grass-fed beef is marketed as grass-fed and sometimes certified organic, with no way to distinguish it from a beef raised on a high-energy mix of grasses, legumes, and forbs, who finish well over time. Secondly, consumers trust the marketing and, when they buy quarters or bundles and have no idea what they're getting. These are customers that are buying direct and don't have the opportunity to see the beef in the store. This, in some instances, I think is kind of a type of deception through omission, and kind of hurts the entire market, really, when you have people that are doing, cull grass-fed dairy that would often grade as D-cut or utility or something, but it's marketed the same way as grass-fed Angus, whose genetics have been selected over the course of many years, for the ability to gain on forage and hay alone. Third, imagine the marketing opportunity. Instead of having to piggyback on other breeds' popularity from other countries, i.e. like American Wagyu and shit like that, perhaps through intensive selective breeding, we could develop some interesting domestic and regional genetics of our own. This sort of system may give some insight into how an animal was raised, I suppose, the current grading system, in conjunction with a grass-fed certification. My biggest complaint with the grading system is the lack of actual nutritional info. Sure, it's fat as hell, but did they just grain and corn this animal to death, or was it riddled with inflammation, arthritis, and diabetes from the CAFO it came from? Or did it accumulate omega-3s and beta-carotene over time to have a well-dispersed intramuscular fat content? The current grading system, in my opinion, has lost its importance as a measure of quality and is more of a slightly deceiving marketing tool that incorrectly insinuates quality of certain levels. We at the Meat Block would love to hear your thoughts on American or international grading systems for a follow-up in the future.
So when grading, it's important to know this when you see, meat, that you don't mistake connective tissue or sinew or silver skin as marbling. A lot of people may do that. And then when you see the fat, that it's evenly distributed, that there's no vein steaks, that there's no, big globs of fat in certain areas. When fat clumps up and you get these big veins, that means the animal put on weight too quickly. So it was raised to achieve a weight. And if you want a more quality fat distribution, it's going to take a little bit longer to get that animal up to slaughter weight, because you're going to want to not gorge it. But that also moves your margin. Throughout my career, I've worked with small farms, and one of the most impressive one was this small, all-pastured, grass-fed, grass-finished beef producer here in Washington. And it was Angus beef. And their Angus, they would take up to about 28 months of age. So they would have that perfect fat distribution. And every morning when I would slaughter, I'd go out there with one of the owners, and he helped breed this bloodline. He helped this herd for generations and generations. And he would point out ones, and he'd be like, all right, you're a few weeks out, and you will kill you probably in 2 months. But those two are the ones I want you to get today. He would be looking at the shoulder, muscle definement, and bone rigidity. He'd be looking at the hips where the rump met the sirloin to see if they had these little divots in them. Just one on either side was an indication that there was a nice, even fat coverage on that sirloin. And if you're a small-scale farmer, it may be a crapshoot. You may take your animal to slaughter prematurely because of feed costs and you may end up with less marbled product, especially if you're a grass-fed, grass-finished farmer. Another thing I want to touch on is the use of the term prime rib. Now, when you go and you buy a prime rib steak, a lot of places, it's not going to be a grading of the steak, but the prime rib is going to be the identifier of the name of the cut. That is not a ribeye. It's a prime rib steak. So you, as the consumer, need to ask, when you see that on the label, is this indicating quality, or is this indicating the name of the cut? And the answer could be both. But I certainly think it is deceiving when people use that terminology with no grading system put in place at their processing facility. Another thing you need to do as the consumer is look. Does it meet visually your fat or marbling expectations? As far as whatever cut it is, maybe, a leaner New York is more your satisfactory, and it doesn't have to be choice or prime. Maybe you'd be happy with a select chuck roll when you're making or braising something. The grading system makes me hesitant in the realm that at your supermarket, you mostly only ever see graded ribeyes, New Yorks, and chucks, and briskets. But what about the other cuts? Where do they end up? I know local wholesalers around my area will carry select knuckles or choice tri-tips for a big discounted price. Or you might find a select top round at one of these stores. Now, a select top round just sounds like a top round. I guess the point I'm trying to make is buy the cut that works for your needs. If you want something lean to turn into a lean stew, then don't be afraid of buying select. If you want something with a little bit of flavor, sometimes a choice chuck roll will be just enough. And go through these bags, because sometimes they label them choice or above, which means that at minimum it's choice. That means they filled out their prime packing house orders already that day before they ship to the general public. So if you're like one of those milkmaids in the movie Clerks and you go through every single bag and you are searching for prime, you may be able to find it. So check the wording if it says select or above, choice or above. This next piece is by Ryan.
The American meat grading system is an example of a regulatory body trying to create transparency and standardization within the food system. Is it biased towards grain-intensive production systems? Sure. Does it present a partial truth, but not the whole truth on meat quality? Absolutely. Does it provide an overly simplified lens through which to look at an animal carcass? Probably. Does it do more harm than good? I don't know. I personally am grateful for the thoroughness of the American meat grading system because it offers some degree of standardization and clarity in the very slippery and murky world of domestic animals raised for food. If a carcass I'm working with receives a grade of standard, select, choice, or prime, this grade tells me something. It gives me a certain amount of information about that carcass, maybe 10% of what I'd like to know. Even though that grade gives me a limited amount of information, still I am grateful for the 10%. 10% is better than having no information. I appreciate having a standardized system in place, a system that is very explicit, very scientific, and not subject to the cloudiness of human emotions. I love human emotions. We need to hear the personal preferences of the experts in our fields, but we also have a strong need for the scientific method in our world, in our lives. We need both. The current grading system is very scientific. It's like a ruler or a yardstick. It's reliable for measuring certain basic attributes. My vote would be to keep the current grading system as it is, but to create several more standalone grading systems that would each be effective at measuring for a focused set of criteria. Thereby, when looked at all together, we might see more of the whole picture. I like to eat young animals, and so does the majority of the American population. The market is saturated with meat from young animals. Younger animals tend to be more tender, and tender meat responds well to hot and fast styles of cooking, such as grilling. Americans like to grill. There you go. If I'm working with a beef that has received a grade of standard, select, choice, or prime, immediately I know that that's from an animal that's under 30 months of age, slaughtered at under 30 months of age, a younger animal. Because implicit in those four grades, standard, select, choice, or prime, is the fact that it's a younger animal. There's separate grades reserved for animals that are over 30 months. Those being commercial, utility, cutter, and canner. So it's determined within this grading system that if an animal is over 30 months of age, there's a separate set of grades that will then be designated to that: commercial, utility, cutter, and canner. You don't hear about these type of grades very much, the over 30-month grades, because usually these over 30-month animals are ground into burger, boned out, and ground into hamburger or mince. If all I ever consumed was meat from young animals, I would consider myself to have experienced only a very small fraction of the meat world. Younger animals represent a small sample size of what is possible. I understand that the economics of raising older animals can be atrocious. So if we're talking economics, let's talk about younger animals as part of the solution. And if we're talking about depth of flavor, slow cooking, and enjoyable eating experience, let's not forget to mention the category of older animals. Mutton has had a huge following in many regions and during many time periods. Raising beef to 3 to 5 years of age has been considered best practice and is still very common in many regions and has been very common during many time periods. Slow cooking methods, barbecue, sous vide methods, when done correctly, can transform tougher cuts into dishes more tender than tenderloin even, and with a great deal more flavor. It's undeniable that more and more people are learning to cook and enjoy secondary cuts and slow cooking cuts. Yet we as a community have no standard criteria to help us determine which animals will produce the flavors and textures we might be desiring. So without standardization, we fall back on the opinions and preferences of those people in our lives who we imagine are knowledgeable. Our local neighborhood butcher, for example. Who better to trust than the local neighborhood butcher? We develop a relationship with these people and we come to trust their expertise. I apologize if I'm bursting anyone's bubbles here, but a lot of butchers lie, and even a lot of honest butchers are simply not knowledgeable enough on the big picture of the meat world, which includes the world of farming. Most butchers have very limited knowledge of farming. Often it's a case of you don't know what you don't know. Many good butchers think they're being honest, think they're steering people in the right direction, or think they're sharing accurate information, but actually might be unintentionally misleading a customer. For example, to say that a prime steak or a Kobe beef steak is the best quality there is an inherently misleading statement. It's partial truth. These highly marbled steaks might represent the optimal meat eating experience to one person, but they also might represent a terrible eating experience to another person. If you walk into any meat shop and inquire about the quality of the meat that they sell, it's very unlikely that a butcher will say, the meat here we sell is, I don't know, it's all right. It's no different than anywhere else, really. Who in their right mind is going to say that? Most places will say they carry the best in town, or the best there is, or the highest quality. These are the kinds of things that you're going to hear. No one's going to say otherwise. Within a shop, you might hear someone say, oh, this stuff over here is all right, but this stuff over here is the shit. This is the good stuff here. So you might see that, you might hear them say that, but they're still going to play up what is the best in their shop and highlight what is the best in their shop. And it's just natural. I love listening to the old-timer cutters I work with as they reflect upon changes in the industry they've seen over the course of their lifetime. As retail meat cutters, these guys were proud of what their store carried and proud to serve their community in this way. For decades, the stores they worked for sold predominantly choice quality steaks, sometimes prime, but mostly choice. They saw a shift as old management left and new management came in, and new management did away with the choice meat. Now most of the stores in my region only sell select beef, and choice beef is much harder to find. The old-timers I work with shake their heads, dismayed at how management cuts corners at the expense of the customer. They shake their head with disapproval when making a buck becomes more important than maintaining the trust of your customer base. They shake their heads with disapproval when integrity goes by the wayside. I admire the sense of pride and duty that these old-timer meat cutters have. I'm fortunate to work with them. But I've also met and worked with some very heinous, integrity-deficient butchers. Guys who sip whiskey all day in the back room. Guys who take, nothing wrong with whiskey, but it doesn't make a great boss if he's drinking all day. Guys who take every opportunity to laugh openly at customers and tell them that they're wrong. Guys who attempt to dominate most discussions and insist that their views are the only correct views. Butchers will do weird things such as spray bleach water on their whole chickens to extend the life of the bird in their meat case. Some shops will avoid cleaning their bandsaw or deep cleaning their meat case for way too long. And these guys get away with it. You'd think that their business would fail or suffer. But on the contrary, sometimes the more arrogant and self-centered you are, the more people are drawn to you. Sometimes the more egotistical you are, the more of a loyal fan base you can create. People seem to love the arrogant, old-timey, overly confident butcher. As long as the butcher plays the part well, people will keep shopping there. Customers seem to get off on the experience. There's something appealing about walking into a butcher shop, hearing the butcher say something ridiculous, maybe even getting insulted by them. It gives people a quaint, old-school feeling that they like. I'm not making this stuff up. There's a romance, there's an allure to the know-it-all butcher. I worked for a butcher shop owner who had a very good, value-added chef's skill set, but zero knife skills and very little knowledge of cut names or how to break down an animal. Yet the general public viewed him as a master butcher and swooned over him regularly, trusted him. His arrogance, together with his thick foreign accent, created an idea that he must know what he's talking about. And if he ever tipped his hand to his low level of butchery knowledge by saying something completely backwards, farmers or customers would just attribute this discrepancy to the language barrier. Oh, there must be a miscommunication, or they must butcher things differently in his country. It never entered into anyone's minds that he had not been a butcher, but not been trained at a butcher, to know anything about butchering from his home country. And he was making things up as he went along here in the States. I've got a lot of respect for this guy, but this was the case. This was the circumstance in this meat shop. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors that occur in the butchery world. Luckily, the flagrant, heinous dishonesty is not as prevalent as the partial truth, accidental, misleading type of dishonesty. Both are to be watched out for, though. To circle back to the grading system, though butchers lie, though butchers are frequently misinformed or only partially knowledgeable, most butchers do have a comprehensive understanding of the American grading system. For this, I am grateful. The grading system allows for some amount of cohesion and consistency that would not exist if there were no such system.
All right, that was awesome. Thanks, Ryan. And that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Meat Block Podcast. And I want to ask you guys, again, we're working on a horror stories episode. We've done several retail horror stories, but now we're just expanding it into horror stories. So tell us, submit, hit us up on social media. Tell us those crazy stories about fist fights, about catching people having sex, or other crazy, crazy shit. Like the time I was working at this plant and we had, firebomb threats from the Animal Liberation Front, and then Homeland Security, just came and hang out for a while. It was pretty fun time. Not really. It was terrible and kind of stressful. Or the time earlier this week that my hand got caught in the blade of the bandsaw and it ripped to shreds my nylon or glove I was wearing. Pretty fun. But I'm not going to go prematurely here because I have so much saved up. As you already know, I am a wealth of stories. I'm a people watcher. And I love telling these tales of the life I've lived. I digress. Anyway, if you want to get a hold of us here at the Meat Block Podcast, you could do so by emailing us at themeatblockpodcast@gmail.com. You could tweet us at themeatblockpod or Instagram at themeatblock. And head over to our Facebook group and join the conversation because there's a lot of great conversation happening over there. And if you want to get a hold of Ryan, he is at Gather and Break on Instagram. David is at A Farm Butcher on Instagram. And I am at American Butcher on Instagram and Facebook. And if you're looking for a way to support the show, no, I'm not asking for money. Well, at least not yet anyway. The best way to do that is by opening up the Apple Podcast app, typing in the Meat Block, leaving it 5 stars, and please please leave a comment. Another way to support the show is by tagging us on social media, like all the wonderful meatheads are doing all across all platforms. And until next time, keep your knives sharp and live in the margin. Here's your outro song.
Rogers said he never met a man he didn't like. Wait, let me back up and make sure I got that right. He might have liked every man he ever met, that's true. But he never said he liked every man that he knew. I met a woman with a Midas touch. I could never get her to touch very much. I met a man of opportunity. He never offered any of it up to me. I met a soldier in a recruit who said he'd make a man out of me and stole my youth. Working for a man who could not stop lying. Drove us all off a cliff and called it flying. That ain't flying. Most men flying seem to understand that a man hasn't technically flown until he lands. If you're coming into land and you crash and die, all you really did for sure was get too high. You ever get too high? No, neither have I, but I will if I have to prove to you guys I'm so turned around I can call him a riot. Fighting for peace, that's like screaming for quiet. But I've been told might meet a little fox in an atheist hole. I don't know, but I've been told. I don't know, but I've been told. I don't know, but I've been told. I don't know for sure, I've just been told.